There's a turning point people never see coming. The moment you stop defending yourself, stop fixing misunderstandings, stop over-explaining what you meant. And suddenly they start paying attention. Silence isn't passive, it's pressure. And when you take your energy back, the truth hits them harder than any speech ever could. Because the moment you stop explaining, they lose their favorite shield, the illusion that everything is your fault and nothing is their responsibility. And that's exactly where the shift begins. There comes a point in every draining connection where you realize you've been doing all the emotional labor, the clarifying, the repairing, the justifying, the softening, the smoothing out every moment that felt rough. You carry the entire weight of the communication while they get to sit back, misinterpret you, blame you, or pretend they don't understand your side, and you keep explaining. Not because you're weak, but because you actually care about clarity. You want peace, not chaos, resolution, not ego games. You think explaining will build understanding. But here's the truth you finally learn the hard way. You cannot explain something to a person who benefits from pretending they don't understand. Some people love confusion because it delays accountability. Some people love your explanations because it gives them power. And some people love your emotional availability because it feeds their avoidance, but then it happens. You hit the internal wall, the exhaustion, the realization that you're giving energy to someone who isn't even meeting you halfway. You stop explaining, not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but because your soul is done performing, and the moment you go quiet, something inside them shifts. Your silence removes the spotlight they were hiding in. Your silence forces them into the truth they ran from. Your silence becomes the mirror they can't escape. Most people think consequences come from confrontation, but they're wrong. The strongest consequences come from detachment. Because when you stop explaining, they finally have to sit with the discomfort they've been outsourcing to you. They feel the distance they never expected you to create. They realize how much emotional stability your explanations were giving them. They notice how empty the dynamic becomes without your effort. This is the moment where their confidence cracks. Not because you punish them, but because you stopped carrying everything for them, and now the silence is doing what your words never could. When you stop explaining, something else happens too. Something people rarely recognize until they're standing in the silence themselves. The balance of emotional power snaps back into place. For the first time, they're not in control of the narrative. They're not steering the conversation. They're not dictating what is true or not true. Now they have to deal with the echo of their own behavior. Because explanations didn't just clarify your intentions. They protected their ego. Your explanations softened the impact of their actions. Your explanations prevented them from feeling the full weight of their choices. Your explanations shielded them from confronting what they actually caused. You weren't just communicating. You were cushioning them. But when you step back, the cushioning disappears. Suddenly, every action they took lands on them with full force. No buffer, no emotional interpreter, no one cleaning up the mess. And this is where the panic starts to grow inside them. That subtle, silent anxiety they try to hide. That restless second-guessing. That uncomfortable awareness that they can't blame you anymore. Silence exposes the truth not loudly but surgically. And that's when realizations begin creeping in. They start replaying the last conversation. They begin analyzing what you meant, the exact way you used to analyze them. They wonder why you haven't explained like you always did. They question whether they pushed too far this time. They fear that maybe you're no longer invested enough to fix it. They notice the lack of presence, the missing warmth, the space you created. Whether they admit it or not, silence puts them in a position they hate, self-reflection. They can't run from themselves anymore. They can't hide behind your words anymore. They can't pretend they didn't know anymore. Your silence forces them to confront the one thing they never wanted to face. Your effort was the glue. And now that glue is gone. This is when the regret begins. Not dramatic regret. Not cinematic regret. But the quiet, heavy, unsettling regret of someone who realizes they misjudged who had the real power the entire time. Because the truth becomes undeniable. They weren't staying because communication was good. They were staying because you made communication easy. And now that you're no longer the emotional translator, the clarity giver, the peacekeeper, the explicable, the dynamic collapses. Everything they thought they controlled turns into something they're suddenly afraid of losing. They start realizing your value exactly when you stop pushing to show it. That's the painful irony of human behavior. As long as you're explaining yourself, they feel safe ignoring you. But the moment you stop, they start understanding you better than ever. And that is the power you never knew you had. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you stop explaining, you don't just change the conversation, you change the entire dynamic. Everything they were comfortable with collapses instantly. You were the one who made emotional clarity possible. You were the one who turned tension into understanding. You were the one who connected the dots they refused to acknowledge. You were the emotional adult holding together a connection they kept destabilizing. And the moment you stop doing that, they're forced into a space they're not built to handle: accountability. People like this hate accountability not because they're evil, but because it demands emotional maturity they never developed. Explaining was your attempt to create stability. Silence becomes the moment when they finally see the chaos they bring. The shift is brutal. Before, they were the one who acted impulsively. You were the one who cleaned up the emotional mess. Now, their behavior sits in front of them like a mirror they can't turn away from. There's no explanation to soften it, no emotional translator to reinterpret it, no reassurance to dilute it. This is why silence hits harder than any lecture. Because silence forces them to hear themselves, and they don't like what they hear. They begin to realize that your explanations weren't a weakness, they were generosity. They were emotional labor. They were the only thing keeping the connection alive long after they stopped contributing anything meaningful. And when that labor stops, the reality becomes undeniable. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just your emotions. It wasn't you overthinking. It was them. The pullback, the inconsistency, the vague excuses, the sudden coldness, all of it. Your silence reveals the pattern with surgical clarity. It exposes what your words tried to fix, and then the fear kicks in. Not the dramatic fear of losing someone instantly, but the deeper fear, the fear of being truly seen. Because now they know you understand what's been happening. You're not explaining anymore because you're not confused anymore. And that scares them more than any argument ever could. This is where realization turns into discomfort. They notice you're not available like before. They notice the emotional tone isn't the same. They notice the gap, the one they created, finally locking into place. They notice your silence makes them feel replaceable. They notice that everything you predicted is now unfolding without you saying a word. Silence exposes the truth they thought they could outrun. And for the first time, they feel the loss before you say it's over. That's the real power shift. The one that hits them in a way explanations never did. Here's what really happens when you stop explaining. They finally have to sit with the consequences of their own behavior, and they're not built for that level of emotional exposure. Most people assume silence is passive. It isn't. Your silence becomes an active force, a pressure they can't negotiate with, can't manipulate, and can't argue against. It becomes the one thing they never expected from you, a boundary that doesn't bend. When you stop explaining, they're forced to recognize that the connection was running on your emotional effort the entire time. Every problem they brushed aside, every feeling they invalidated, every moment they pretended not to understand, now it sits in their lap with no escape hatch. They start replaying every moment, not because they suddenly grew a conscience, but because without your explanations, their mind fills the silence with questions that cut straight into their ego. Did I push too far? Is this the point where they're done? Were they serious when they said they needed more? Did I misread everything? Are they pulling away from me now? Your silence flips the script. Now they are the one overthinking. What used to be your emotional burden becomes their internal noise. And slowly they realize something brutal. You weren't explaining because you were insecure. You were explaining because you cared. You weren't clarifying because you were needy. You were clarifying because you were invested. You weren't communicating because you were desperate. You were communicating because you actually had emotional intelligence. And now that you've stopped, they feel the shift in their bones. The distance finally hits them. Not when you cried, not when you begged, not when you tried to fix things, but when you went quiet, because that's the moment they understand. You're no longer trying to save something. That's already dying. People only panic when they realize your silence isn't an invitation for them to return. It's a signal that you've already begun to detach. That's the moment realization turns into regret. Regret not because they lost something, but because they finally see exactly how much of the connection was sustained by you. Your clarity, your patience, your explanations, your emotional grounding, your willingness to try. And now, you're done explaining. You're done proving. You're done pleading. You're done carrying the entire emotional weight alone. Your silence becomes the full stop they never saw coming. Because the truth is simple. When you stop explaining, they start realizing. When you stop chasing, they start noticing. When you stop overgiving, they start valuing. When you stop lowering your standards, they finally see the height of them. And when you finally choose yourself, that's when they understand exactly what they just lost. Not because of punishment, not because of revenge, but because absence hits harder than any explanation ever could.